Vrak. Even all these years after that godforsaken planet was finally taken, that word alone still caused the blood of anyone that was there for even just a week to run cold. I know mine does. My right hand also begins to shake, sometimes violently, and my left leg will not sit still, continually bouncing up and down. I'm told it's due to wounds from the war, combined with my PTS. Anyway, as I mentioned before, the Vrak campaign was composed of some of the longest and worst battles the UEE has ever seen. By extension, it was one of the longest planetary campaigns the UEE ever partook in. Only a very select few came close, such as the campaign for Mars during the final war. The reason was Vrak was considered the kingpin of the Hadzai's second defensive string of planets. We could have bypassed them. We'd go out of our way to recapture every planet that we'd lost, but once we hit Hadzai territory, that wasn't necessary. However, most of the planets in this string had been major centers of industry and the military before the war, and were where the forces that took over the Hydides cluster had staged. A few had been targets of the opening strike, but it had been a long time since then, and some of the damage had been repaired. They also played host to the first real naval presence we'd encountered thus far. If we turned our backs to them, the Hadzai could easily launch raids on our supply lines, tying down important assets. Their industrial power was also desirable. Those at the top figured if we held them when the war was over, it would be easier to demand them as concessions from the Hadzai if we had troops on them. We also wished to use the planets as staging bases of our own for our continued drive into the Hadzai Empire, so they had to be taken. Vrak was naturally the largest and most well-developed of them. More than a few of its factory and mining facilities had been targets of the first strike. But the Hadzai seemed to have paid closer attention to it than most of the other planets. So a lot of the damage had been fixed. By the time I got there, the campaign had already been going for half a year with no discernible progress being made. Despite a constant UEE presence, the Hadzai's navy used what ships they had left to run the blockade to keep the garrison supplied, and they seemed barely affected. Altar jammers still prevented us from getting a truly complete picture of things, but as far as we could tell, resistance was concentrated around the main hubs of industry. There were 6 of them, spread out over an area about the size of Greenland. From the central hub, the other 5 spread out like spokes on a wheel and acted as anchors. The Hadzai had taken great pains to build up the defenses. The perimeter was in the defense-in-depth style with a depth of over 30 miles, consisting of a massive network of mutually supporting trenches, bunkers, and foxholes with overlapping fields of fire and pre-planned fallback locations in case of a withdrawal. Later on, there would be locations in the more rearward area that were pre-sited for concentrated fire, once the Hadzai rediscovered artillery. More lines of fortifications were laid out so that if any of the outer hubs were taken, the perimeter could be relocated in a number of different ways to keep the central hub, the largest one, protected. They had dug a massive underground tunnel system that enabled them to relocate large forces from one location to another quickly without being detected. The entire area was densely covered in SSM and AAA sites, especially around the altar jammers and the land area above their deeply buried and heavily reinforced underground power plants. The Hadzai weren't stupid. Needing open sky to function, the jammers had to be placed above ground, and if they went down, the scales would tip in our favor. Without their protection, we'd be able to use precision orbital bombardment to take out just about anything we needed to, and be able to overwhelm their defenses before they could repair or rebuild them. Being what they were, each hub contained its own massive stockpile of military hardware, and their industrial capacity meant they could replace losses for as long as they had the materials, which they could get from within the perimeter from mines. Each hub also had its own source of water from underground tables, as well as enormous reservoirs that were also located underground. When combined with the ability to bring at least some water supplies in from off-world, they had enough to support the entire garrison for decades. Some food was grown on site, but most of it was in the form of military rations from the stockpiles, and that which was shipped in, and of that, they also had enough to feed the garrison for just as long. Speaking of the garrison, it was massive, easily the largest we'd encountered so far, and one of the largest of the war. 20 million combat troops with another 115 million to operate the factories, mines, and such, as well as to support the people at the front line, which had a total length of some 3,600 miles. The word fortress barely even begins to describe that place. We, of course, didn't know about all of this at the time, but I might as well tell you all this now, so you can see how impossible our job was. As for our positions, when we had landed, we'd kept the defenses light with the expectation that they'd be moving. Over time though, as movement was more and more unlikely, the defenses had gotten thicker and thicker. Unlike in our drive through Hyades, the HFY had sizable air power on Vrak. The skies remained contested, with dogfights being common, and most CAS missions having to fly low to avoid interception, and thus be easily within range of smaller SAM batteries and man-portable air defense systems, or manpads. Unlike us, the HFY did not really utilize bunker-busting munitions, meaning to destroy our positions. They needed to blast them out with sheer firepower, which was hard to bring to bear in the quantities needed without air superiority. Our forces obviously had to at least match, if not surpass, those of the enemy. To this end, we had landed a force of 60 regional armies, or about 120 million personnel. Of them, about 30 million were combat troops. To better organize and coordinate such high numbers, a new unit was created called planetary groups, which were each made up of 12 regional armies for a total of 5 planetary groups. With another 135 million on the enemy's side, and no progress made by anyone, the Vrak campaign had become the mother of all stalemates. It was decided that more men would be needed if any progress was to be made. This is where my unit came into play. We would be a part of those reinforcements. The second Vrak would be one of 12 freshish REs that would form the 6th planetary group. Another 24 million men to throw at the HFY, bringing the total up to 144 million personnel. 36 million combat troops backed by another 108 million support troops. Now I believe I should explain why I'm able to remember everything I am before I continue any further. When I started relating my story, I mentioned getting a neutral implant. Every member of the UEE military gets one when they sign up. It increases the mental capacity of a person, enabling them to remember more and remember it much more clearly. It also enables connectivity with some gear like a helmet's HUD. Some of the more advanced ones can even enable technological telepathy. It's a quick and largely non-invasive procedure nowadays, but the implant itself can still malfunction. The way it is attached means that once implanted, it cannot be removed. To do so would, at best, impair one's abilities, and at worst, kill them. However, thanks to this interface, it is possible that once this increased ability to remember is no longer needed, it can be reversed selectively, essentially dulling memories and reducing one's ability to remember the worst of what they've seen. This has decreased the severity of PTS our veterans experience. For example, they can still remember that their best friend died in battle, but they can't really remember holding his intestines in while he cries for his mother. I, however, do not have this choice. I could explain how it malfunctioned, but I won't, because really, how it did doesn't really matter. That it did, does. Thanks to this problem, not only can I remember everything I've seen since I got it, I can remember it all in painful detail. What's worse, when my brain reorganizes my old memories to make more room for new ones, some of my old ones get lost. I can do mental exercises to push back against my brain losing certain memories. But there is only so much time in the day. I have to be selective in what I chose to protect, and this does not yet apply to my memories of the war. For whatever reason, maybe because they are still relatively fresh, they're easier for my brain to organize. I don't honestly know. Regardless, the effect is what matters. Everything I saw before the war is slowly being forgotten, and leaving the majority of what I can remember, at least with any clarity, being the horrors of the war itself. So yeah, figured I'd explain the level of detail I'm able to give. It is a challenging thing to endure, but endure it I have. So far, considering the suffering the war brought, I guess I'm lucky. Still alive, if that truly counts for anything. Back to the story. When we came in on the dropships to land, we could see that we were not landing anywhere near one of the main hubs, but rather a less densely built-up section of the line. The view was strangely serene. There were no shell craters on our side, and the trenches seemed to be in pristine condition. We could see the landing area, which had gone from a rough clearing to a well-laid-out and fortified staging area, complete with landing pads, walls high enough to hide the 20-foot-tall T-45 dropships, maintenance areas, barracks, depots, and a connection to the underground rail system that would transport personnel from the landing area to the front line without being seen. It could easily handle an entire army, maybe two if needed. We could also see the second line of fortifications that protected our artillery. Not quite as thick as the front line, but definitely not easy to get through. As we got closer, we could also see the staging area was actually filled with groups of men that were waiting near the landing pads. When we landed, we found out they were wounded preparing to leave on the transports we just came on. We touched down and started to offload. We'd seen plenty of combat at this point, so the state of the men that were leaving didn't really bother us. Each transport group was greeted by an officer that directed us to stop by one of the supply depots and pick up as much supplies as we could carry. Ammo, food, meds, said we'd need it. As my guys went through, I made sure to pull out 5 cartons of cigarettes, as well as a few candy bars in addition to ammo and extra stims. Never knew when a smoke or a bite of something sweet could help one's mental state. Once we got our extra supplies, we made our way to assemble by one of the rail stations. Each train was massively long, able to carry an entire division, and each station could handle 3 trains at a time. It would take 2 runs of each station to get an entire army from staging to the front line. They would take 2 infantry divisions, and either the artillery or tank division before coming back for the remaining 3. There were 4 stations, one for each of the sectors this staging point was responsible for. It was one hell of an operation, keeping everything running smoothly. Now I had said that we were not really disturbed by the state of the wounded when we landed. However, what we saw as we mustered by the rail station we'd be taking to the front very much did disturb us. As we stood there waiting for everyone to get together, those of us in the back started to hear murmuring coming from the front. Some of us pushed our way to the front, and what we saw chilled us to the core. Coming out of the station was what was left of the 679th. They came out in groups of 3 or 4 or solo. Not a single one of them wasn't covered in filth, and seemingly all of them were wounded in some way or the other. Some were being helped along by their less wounded comrades. There was one girl, a sergeant, that was being carried bridal style by one of her buddies, while another walked beside them, gently rubbing the sergeant's shoulder, as if to comfort her. While dirty, the sergeant didn't seem to be as injured as her comrades were. However, she was shaking uncontrollably and mumbling something. Those of us close enough could hear what she was saying, and if seeing their state chilled us to the core, her words struck a special kind of fear into us. They don't stop coming. They don't stop coming. They just keep coming. Why won't they stop coming? Why do they keep coming? When she finally passed, we then had the misfortune of seeing the state of Major General Kira Nartoba. As she approached, we all instantly saw that her left arm had been completely blown off at the shoulder. She was smoking a cigarette with her right hand, and when she lifted it to put the cig back between her lips, we could see her middle and ring fingers on that hand had been amputated. The left side of her face was also pockmarked with minor wounds, likely from shrapnel of some kind. Like all of the women of the 679th, her hair had also been buzzed off at some point, even though she usually wore it at shoulder length. As she walked up to us, gave us a grin that gave off the impression she was no longer altogether mentally. It wasn't helped by the fact that several of her teeth were missing, and she had what would definitely become a scar that ran from just below her left eye, across her lips, and to the bottom of her chin. Any of us that weren't affected by the state of the 679th, or the muttering of the broken sergeant, definitely were by the state of General Nartoba, and what she said to us, as she stopped to stand before us, casting glances at guys that had chosen to load themselves down with ammo at the supply depot. Better get yourselves more ammo. That ain't going to be enough. By itself, that doesn't mean much, but when you consider that between what we were normally issued, what extra we usually had, and the extra we'd gotten at the supply depots, we were currently carrying more ammo than what the entire 245th Army had shot in every previous campaign combined, and you can understand how her telling us we didn't have enough ammo got to pretty much everyone rattled. Our division CO Major General Alexander Harrison stepped out from the crowd and asked her what had happened. She replied simply, "We fought on Vrak for a month, that's all." We were now somehow even more shocked. They had only been planetside for a month, and they had been reduced to this state. General Harrison tried to be sympathetic and said, "Well, General, you must now look to the well-being of your division." Kira's sudden outburst of nearly unhinged laughter caught us all off guard. We could all tell it was laughter born of grief, trauma, sadness, and anger. "General Harrison, I have no division." One of the junior officers managed to push back the confusion that had come over all of us, and asked how many of them were there now. She looked at him, and took a drag off her smoke. 1,500, probably less. One of the men had been taking a sip from his water bladder when she said that, and he started to cough violently from choking on his drink. A division of 20,000 being cut down to 1,500 meant, on average, roughly 600 women of the 679th had died every single day of their deployment. Obviously it was more up and down than that, but that didn't change how terrifying of a prospect that was. Kira then left us with some advice that did likely save some lives. "Listen, get more ammo. Always wear your vest and helmet even when you sleep, and for fuck's sake, don't slack off on sentry duty. You want everyone awake before you hear the screeching whoops of thousands of monkeys charging at you. Maybe then more of you will survive than we did." With that she turned and continued on to one of the landing pads. We were left in stunned silence. I saw more than a few guys quietly slip away to get back to the supply depots. I considered it too, but I was already carrying 140 pounds of stuff, which included 900 rounds of ammo, so I stayed put. Needless to say, we were now much more on edge than we had been before we arrived. Once the remnants of the 679th finished leaving the station, and the guys that returned to the supply depot got back, we loaded up onto this massive train. It was quite the experience navigating this multi-mile-long train, but as for the trip, most of us were silent. The gravity of what we were getting into was really sinking in by the time we arrived at the front. As we piled out of the train, we were organized by brigade, and led along separate tunnels leading to the sections we'd be responsible for. It really makes you feel small being led by the thousands, puts into perspective how much of a cog in the machine you are. Once we made it to the surface, we spread out and took up the 679th's old positions. The trenches were worse off than our view from the sky implied. They were made of concrete, and were covered in bullet impacts, chunks taken out from grenade explosions, and were coated in random blotches of blood.
The dugouts that we would be sleeping in still had most of the 679th's possessions in them. Personal items, weapons, clothing. They had really just dropped everything and left. What we noticed a lack of was ammo. Plenty of empty ammo cans and piles of empty ammo cases all over the place, but very little unfired ammo. Seemed Kira was serious about the usage of ammo. Our firing positions were in the same state. Mangled remains of equipment, haphazardly piled out of the way along with the damage and blood expected from positions constantly overwhelmed and grenaded. We could now see why the 679th was in the state they were. We started to wonder if we really would suffer their fate. Still, we had a job to do, and our officers settled in and got us to work. We cleared out all the broken equipment and piles of shell casings. We packed up the personal possessions of the 679th to be returned to them and did our best to clean up the blood. We got our crew-served weapons set up and added as much fortification as we could, mostly additional sandbags. Took a few days, but our positions started to look better. Once the trenches were in better shape, we set up additional lines of barbed wire to try and slow these apparent charges the Hadzai liked to engage in. It was curious that the Hadzai would choose to attack when all they needed to do was sit behind their fortifications and wait for us to come to them. In our previous fights, they wouldn't launch an attack unless its success would gain them an advantage. They weren't afraid to fight, but didn't blindly throw away lives. Then again, if the state of the 679th was anything to go by, whatever tactic they were using was working. Now normally we would add motion sensors to the wire to give us some advanced warning, but apparently there was a shortage of them. So instead we took a page out of our ancestors' playbook and scrounged up all the metal cans we could, put rocks in them and attached them to the barb so they'd make noise if disturbed.
After a week, we brought our positions up to as high of a level of readiness as we could. It wasn't until that was over that we noticed that we had not been attacked at all. This went against everything we had been led to believe the situation would be like. Once we realized that, our nerves started getting to us again. Our sentries, already on edge, were now really nervous. We started to get false alarms, which began to affect our sleep. The constant distant sounds of battle and aerial dogfights didn't help either. Then, finally, they came. I was on sentry duty one night, and was talking to Henry about our situation when we heard the rattle of cans. Despite the false alarms, we remembered what Kra had told us about not slacking off. So when the rattle echoed across the field, Henry quickly took up our Men 2A7, while I grabbed my M24, the standard issue assault rifle, and joined him in peering out of our concrete pillbox. As soon as my line of sight leveled to look along the ground, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. I grabbed the clacker for our warning flare and fired it. The moment the flare ignited, light flooded the field, and what I saw about caused me to shit myself. There were hundreds of Hadzai infantry spread out in front of me, a lot of them less than 10 yards away. For perspective, the barbed wire was roughly 30 yards out. This was just in front of me. More Hadzai were on either side of this group for as far as I could see. There had to be thousands of them. It seemed most of them had managed to actually navigate the wire, and it was only by sheer luck that one of the guys in the back had got caught by it and warned us. It seemed like an eternity passed as me and Henry stared these hundreds of Hadzai down, but really, it was only about half a second before Henry opened up on them with the 50. Training was to fire it in bursts of about 5 rounds, but there were so many of them so close that his only choice was to just hold the trigger down and sweep them from left to right. I screamed out contact, as loud as I could, as if the sound of a 50 on automatic wasn't loud enough to wake up everyone in a half-mile radius, brought my M24 up, and opened fire. A few seconds after we started shooting, warning flares all along the line went off and more gunfire erupted. Even though I couldn't see it directly, by sound I could just about hear men as they started piling out of their dugouts, taking up their positions and letting loose on this horde. Thanks to our 50, most of the hardzai closest to us were torn to shreds, and those Henry didn't get, I got with my fire. However, they had gotten so close that the men that were just getting to their positions were almost instantly overrun. I could hear the cries of men as they shot, bayoneted, and clubbed each other to death, but I focused on just laying down as much accurate fire as I could. After running through 3 full magazines, a big explosion went off beside our position. From its size, I knew what caused it, and scanned the horde. I just managed to spot 2 hardzai operating a spiker. Spikers were these huge, barely man-portable mortars that lobbed 50-pound shells filled with 35 pounds of explosives, specifically made to crack pillboxes like ours. They were about 400 yards back from the attack. Close enough I could hit them, but far enough that it wasn't going to be easy in the dark. I rested my rifle on a sandbag and adjusted the 4x power scope on my rifle for 400. I did my best to focus on the moment and block out all the noise around me. My scope had a mild form of light magnification that brightened things just enough for me to be sure that I had one of the operators in my sight. Once I was satisfied, I squeezed the trigger. Almost the instant I did that, I was shoved from the left side. Grenade. I barely had time to register the word, and that it was Henry's voice before it went off, showering the pillboxes opening, and some of the interior in shrapnel. As I fell, my head bounced off the wall. Normally, that wouldn't be a problem, but right before the cans had jingled, I'd taken my helmet off to brush some dust out of my hair. So I started to bleed a bit from the hit, and my vision blurred slightly. Henry was snarling in pain. When I asked if he was all right, he said he took some small little pieces of shrapnel to the face. As he finished speaking, I pushed myself against the wall just in time to see a shape appear in the doorway to the pillbox. Thanks to the blurring in my eyes, I couldn't tell whether it was human or hardzai, but I wasn't going to take the chance. Anyone with a brain would have known to not rush into a pillbox in the middle of the night, while also in the middle of a firefight, without announcing themselves. I whipped my Eng out from its holster and put 3 rounds of .45 ACP in their chest. They dropped to the ground, but before I even had time to process that, another form appeared. I put another 4 into their chest, and down they went. Once the intruders were dealt with, Henry was able to compose himself and moved over to me, asking if I was all right. I lightly shoved him aside and said I was fine as I changed out the magazine in my pistol and holstered it. I wiped the blood from my eyes and felt around for my M24. Returning to the opening, I poked my rifle out. While we'd been distracted, some more flares had been set off, but with blood constantly coming down into my eyes, I still could barely see. I fired off a magazine, but was sure I wasn't hitting anything. I told Henry about my vision, and we switched positions. With the .50, I had a better chance of hitting what I wanted to. I started firing in bursts of about 4 rounds at any shape that moved, wiping blood away when I could. Between the thunderous bursts, I could hear the much sharper snaps of Henry's M24 as he took out the ones I wasn't. After about 5 minutes of firing, I finally had to change belts. I yelled over to Henry to help me. It had been about 15 minutes since the attack started, but between bouts of impaired vision, I could see there were still thousands more hardzai rushing towards us. It felt as if our gun was the only one doing anything, but I knew that wasn't the case. There were just too many of them. Right before Henry finished loading the next .50 cal belt, we could both hear that very distinctive howling whistle every infantryman knew instantly. Artillery fire. A second later, an orange explosion lit up the night. We had to look away as the sudden bright light was a little intense. Then another orange-yellow explosion followed it right after. Then another, and another. They started coming in so fast, they stopped sounding like explosions. Instead, they slowly transformed into what sounded like 1,000 drums of all different sizes, and all being rapidly beat out of sync. They started out at about 100 yards out, but slowly crept closer. When we could tell they were less than 40 yards out, we ducked below the pillbox opening, making sure to pull the .50 in and close the metal shutter to prevent any shrapnel from entering. The sound had been already incredible from 100 yards out, but as they came closer, and despite the dulling effect of the now closed opening, they became more and more thunderous until they were utterly deafening. We'd been instructed in training that if subjected to artillery bombardment, we were to get on our knees and elbows, turn away from the explosions, cover our ears, and open our mouths to help equalize the pressure in your body to that of the environment around you. We weren't technically being fired at, but the range was so close, we might as well have been, so we did as we had been instructed. I will not lie. As me and Henry sat huddled next to the closed pillbox opening, hands over our ears and mouths agape, staring at the concrete floor, a new feeling crept over me. I'd been in combat for more than a year by this point. I'd charged machine guns, fought in vicious close-quarters hand-to-hand fighting, where the smallest mismovement could cost you your life, and had more than my share of near-death encounters. But in that moment, with the world just outside of the protection of our concrete pillbox seemingly coming to an end to the beat of 1,000 out-of-sync drums, I felt truly and utterly terrified for my life. It was all-consuming, like a tsunami of terror that was washing over me. The urge to move, to get out of there, to go anywhere but there, was growing. Somewhere, deep in the back of my racing mind, I knew what was happening. I was starting to panic. I also knew that if I stepped outside that doorway, there was a very good chance I'd be cut down by shrapnel. I closed my eyes, not that I could see anything anyway, and took over conscious control of my breathing. I forced myself to take long deep breaths. I forced my mind to stop thinking about the shaking ground and thunder of artillery fire, and to instead think of home. Of my wife Cassie, of my 3 young children, Alexander, Brooke and Bridget. To think about the time when we'd gotten Alexander his first dog. He had named him Strongboy. I thought about when I first held Brooke and Bridget, who were identical twins, in the hospital. I remembered the look on my parents' faces when they first saw their newly born granddaughters. I reminisced about the big cookout we'd had for me and Cassie's 10th anniversary, and how she fussed over how done the hot dogs were. Slowly but surely, I managed to slow my heart rate and dissipate the feelings of panic. Almost at the same time, my brain started to pick up on the fact that the artillery was starting to slacken. The drum beat became more and more spaced apart. They transformed from a constant beating of unrhythmic drums back to individual explosions. Then I could start actually counting the explosions, able to say the number in my mind, before the next one. Finally, they stopped altogether. Anyone that's been in heavy contact, and had artillery drop on them like we did, will know that after such noise and confusion, everything gets silent. Eerily silent. Almost as if you've lost the ability to hear. Your ears have been overwhelmed with noise, and can no longer hear the softer noises around you. Me and Henry took a moment, before looking at each other, and dropping our hands and closing our mouths. I slowly grabbed the shutter lever, and pushed it up. Once it was open, we slowly lifted our heads over the edge. The soft red glow of the flares dimly illuminated the field in front of us. My eyesight was sharp again, thanks to the blood no longer running down my face, but just dropping out of the bruised opening on my forehead, since I had been leaning forward. As for what I saw, well, it's hard to describe, even with being able to remember every detail. Most of the ground in front of us, which when we had last seen it had been covered in corpses, was now a moonscape of numerous craters, many a couple feet deep.
Many were connected to other craters by other shallower craters. I'd seen what the impact of a 155 mm artillery round does to the ground. They don't throw up as much dirt as you think they would. For them to have done this much damage, there must have been thousands of them. Most of the bodies had been completely destroyed, but the sheer volume we'd killed meant that there were still plenty of pieces laying all over, arms, legs, some shattered skulls, entails. We really chewed them up, Henry said, finally breaking the silence. I could only nod. Our hearing started to normalize, and we could hear as everyone else also started to shake off the shock of what had just happened, and started tending to any wounded as well as readying their weapons in case the Hardzai made another attack. Henry moved to finish reloading the M2 when I heard someone approaching our pillbox from behind. I turned, ready to pull my Angie again, but as expected, it wasn't a Hardzai. "Reed, you guys still alive in there?" The voice belonged to our company's second-in-command, First Lieutenant Nikita Rusov. I relaxed and replied that we were. He then turned the corner. He carried two big boxes that I recognized as .50 cal ammo cans. He stepped over the two dead bodies in the doorway, which I still couldn't identify since blood was once again running into my eyes, and set the cans down next to the 50, which Henry had finished reloading. "Figured you guys could use some more." He looked us over. "You're both lucky to have come out of that with just some scratches." I nodded, wiping the blood away again. "How's things out there?" I asked. His face, barely illuminated by the outside light, turned grim. "Not good. Quarter of the company's dead or wounded. Things aren't much better to the left or right of us. Worst part is, at least a few of the dead are from our own artillery." I shook my head as I opened a nearby ammo can, retrieved one of the 100-round packs from inside, and started refilling and packing my M24 magazines, while Henry situated the two new cans where he could best reach them. "Speaking of artillery, who called that barrage in? Never seen any like it." I trailed off, the memory of what had happened just a couple minutes ago, and the fear that came with it, right back into the forefront of my mind. That was Colonel Kalos. Rusov started like I said. Things got pretty rough out there. They were all over us. I even think a few got through us. Can't be sure though, and they'll definitely be no match for the artillery and landing zone's defenses. I will say, however, that was quite the display. Had to have been an entire corps worth of artillery pieces. I'd like to say I can't imagine them trying another assault after that, but if things have been going the way Kira said they were, I wouldn't be surprised. Whatever the case, you guys keep your eyes open, and that 50 ready. The flares should be reloaded by now. I got to go check on the others. Oh, and don't be surprised if more of those strikes come in. If they attack again, we'll probably need them. Both of us replied in the affirmative, and gave the lieutenant a salute, which he returned before exiting the pillbox. I went to grab my helmet, but Henry stopped me, and said, "Should tend to that scratch before it gets any worse." I merely nodded, and sat quietly while he grabbed some gauze and biogel from our first aid box, and cleaned up my head. When he was done, I returned the favor by removing the small bits of shrapnel from his face, as best I could in the dim light provided by the quickly dying flares. "You know," I said jeeringly, "this is probably an improvement. You always had a scruffy face. Least now you'll get some scars for the ladies to like." He chuckled and said, "Scars or no, I still look better than you." I gave him a breathless huff. When I was done, we took up our weapons, slapped on our helmets, and returned to looking out over the field. We'd just got snuggled in when I could hear a light pounding noise in the distance, and it was growing louder. I couldn't make out what it was, until it got within about 150 yards. It was the sound of running boots. I immediately hit the clacker for a fresh flare, When it reached its peak and popped, it flooded the field once more with warm red light. In that light, I could see the shapes of thousands of HFY charging straight for us, running down into a crater before cresting the other side, and going down into another. Once they realized they were spotted, they started to let out a yell that sounded like a cross between a screaming rabbit, wolf howl, and a deep whoop. After that artillery barrage, I was sure nothing else could scare me, but that noise sent a chill right down my spine. Henry muttered a soft "Jesus Christ" before calming himself and letting loose with the 50, this time firing in the standard 5-round bursts. I opened fire with my M24. We downed dozens, but hundreds more kept coming. The rest of the line, still at their posts from the last attack, let off their flares for more light before also opening fire. Within about 5 minutes, artillery rounds again started impacting in front of us, though not nearly as rapidly as before. Some HFY were thrown into the air like leaves, while others simply ceased to be when a shell made a direct hit. As I emptied one magazine and reached for another, I didn't know exactly what the future held for us on Vrak, but I did know one thing. It was going to be a long, long night.